Hi everyone, I'm John Atack, and yet again I have the incredible pleasure of welcoming Karen de la Carrière.
Hello, John. Atack.
Atack, yes, not attack.
Atack.
Atack.
John Atack. I said it right, didn't I?
I'm sorry? You did.
I said it right, didn't I? Yeah.
You did, but a lot of people seem to think that it should be said otherwise for reasons unknown to me. It's a medieval term. It means under the oak tree. Nothing about attacking anybody. At oak. That's all it is. And that's where I live, underneath an oak tree. It's well known.
Well, I love medieval connections of any sort. And
we should all have them.
Yeah. Hi everybody. Hi. We got a good show for you. Before we get going, I'll remind you now.
Rally the troops.
Please join this forum. We want you as our audience. We want you back. We want you updated on every little nugget of truth and knowledge you can get from this channel. I'm also going to do my pitch again. Can you just do,
go for it.
If you please can subscribe, a one-time donation of any amount. Give me $5, just do it. Or even better, do a monthly little contribution. This now takes you out of being a hit and run spectator and makes you a participant in keeping the show on the road. John and I would love you to do that.
We would.
Please put in a little something in exchange for the wisdom you will get here. Okay, let's go on with the show.
Let's rock. So we had a little bit of news today that's been published at the wonderful underground bunker, Tony Ortega's hiding place where he shelters from Scientology and protects himself, about this bizarre case that's going on involving these private detectives who were following somebody and got themselves involved in a rape. And it comes out that there's an allegation that Scientology wanted to assassinate Leah Remini. Now, I can understand why they'd want to do that, because I imagine that she's severely impacted their revenues over the last few years. You'd think they have enough money by now, though, wouldn't you, really? They could just stop it all and go away to the Dutch Antilles and have a nice, easy life on the beach. But I think David Miscavige really enjoys shouting at people and humiliating them. And so the thought of retiring to the beach is not uppermost in his mind. Over the years, I've heard on a number of occasions, it's been suggested to me that somebody was going to be targeted and killed. And I must say that when I was out there pretty much on my own for some years, that was in my mind, you know, that I was followed by people with guns and things like that.
Yeah.
And of course, back in the 60s, Ron Hubbard himself issued the so-called R245 orders. R2 for Route 2 from the book Creation of Human Ability, and the Process 45, which when he delivered the lecture, he said he fired a shot through the stage with his Colt 45 to show you what exactly he meant by R245. And he talks about it being a process of exteriorization that I think is frowned upon in our society at this time, shooting somebody in the head. So that's what R245 means. And then in the 60s, when the Australian inquiry happened in Victoria, Australia, Kevin Victor Anderson, who was the barrister of the Queen's Counsel who was heading the inquiry, was one of several people on whom an R245 order was issued by Ron Hubbard. And they were put on the front of the Auditor newsletter, Auditor magazine, telling any Scientologists they could go ahead and kill these people. So we've had that kind of in the abstract, and it's been there, and we know there's been a great deal of criminality in Scientology, you know, leading to Mary Sue Hubbard and 10 others being imprisoned after her almost 300-page stipulation of evidence admitting all of these dreadful things she'd done. But murder is not, I've not actually been suspicious in dreadful deaths like Lisa McPherson, and many of them, quite a lot of suicides, but I've not actually tracked a murder down, or an attempted murder. And this...
Did David Mayo ever tell you the story of the assassin that showed up with...
He did, yeah. And
he told me this numerous times. You know, David moved to New Zealand after that. After this, he got out of the United States. It traumatized him. Go ahead and tell the little David Mayo blurb on the assassin showing up. Well, he talked the assassin out of it, right?
Yes, he said that what happened was that as I recollect, I talked with him, I think it was 2013. I had a very long conversation with him, not having talked since, I don't know, the early 90s or something. And I was surprised and humbled by the conversation, because I realized that I'd misread David Mayo in some ways when I'd interviewed him, because he seemed very cold. And I realized that he was actually having his teeth replaced from having run round a pole and, you know, suffered terrible damage from it when I first met him. And it made him seem very somber, because he was very concerned about his mouth and suffering a certain amount of pain. So just to say that when I had this long conversation with him in 2013, I came away really liking him and really respecting his intelligence. He was a physicist as a young man, and decided to pursue Scientology instead of physics, and obviously a very brainy sort of person. But he was, what was the island he was on? He was on one of the Caribbean islands, was it?
Yeah.
I don't remember, but...
The one on the left side of Haiti?
Yeah. Left side of Haiti.
Go there on the Apollo. I go blank on names.
Yeah, for some reason it's not
Caribbean anyway.
To my mind. But and this, as I recollect, he said this chap approached him in the end and said, "Look, I've been hired to kill you, but I've been watching you, and it seems to me that this would be a wrong thing to do. You seem like a decent sort of chap." And they sat down and talked. But again, not able to trace that back. We don't have an order. We don't have a smoking gun, thankfully. So David lived some years longer because there wasn't a smoking gun. I've heard stories about Miscavige wanting to exact revenge using his crossbow on people, but this is putting us into different territory. That we talk about cult groups, it's such a loose term. So I try and talk about authoritarian groups where you have some bully who thinks that they're qualified to tell people what to do, and people who want to be told what to do. And authoritarianism to me is the fundamental problem. It's not cults. It's the attitude of mind that says, I believe in democracy. I know it's a faulty system, and I agree with what Churchill said about it, which is it is a faulty system, but it's the best we've found. And seeing countries where, say North Korea is a pretty good example of what happens when you have a completely authoritarian society that just, of course, is following the traditional pattern of monarchy, that the succession goes to the surviving male children, and that's gone on for centuries. It's just very strange in our time, as we're struggling towards democracy. I don't think we've actually found it anywhere yet in a real sense where the majority of people agree on something, and that's what happens. But what happens is that within these little authoritarian cults, these little bubbles come up, and there's such a broad spectrum, from groups that who cares, that they only wear wool, and they stir their compost with a sheep's skull. I'm not mentioning any names here. That's at one end of the spectrum, that the things these people are doing are not harmful, so let them do it, let them believe in it. At the other end, you have a group like Aum Shinrikyo. And in the mid-90s, they hit the headlines by putting sarin gas into the Tokyo underground. I believe there were 12 deaths, only 12 because of a very heroic employee of the underground who actually realized what was happening and started getting the place cleared out. I believe he lost his life. They had enough sarin gas to kill 4 million people.
Yeah.
So this starts out as it's a sort of a martial arts cult started by a man who's almost blind. Hubbard, wow, man who's almost blind, crippled and blind at the end of World War II. A man called Asahara. And you get into this situation where he had a heart surgeon, a very well-known heart surgeon in Japan, and he was actually ordering him to kill patients, and they were being killed. And you look at that and you go, well, this group still exists. It's splintered into 2 different factions, but they're still around. And they believed in a religious doctrine. You know, people get interested in religion, and religion being a wonderful thing. And the doctrine is called Poa. And it's a Buddhist, it's a very unusual Buddhist doctrine. It's not one I'd ever heard of. Jeffrey probably is much more knowledgeable about this than me, and he and I will talk about Buddhism at some point. The doctrine of Poa is that you accelerate somebody's karma. You make the bad things happen to them so that they will be free of their karma. And you can see how this insanity goes, well, if we killed everybody, that would accelerate their karma. And so the whole Japanese population would be wiped out and they'd all be reborn happy in some monstrous fantasy world. And I would say that, you know, if we're looking at authoritarian extremist cults, sects, we have to include groups like Al-Qaeda, like Islamic State, because what happens is they become willing to, as Robert J. Lifton puts it, to dispense with the existence of others. They become willing to kill other people without, you know, blushing, without thinking about it. We saw the same thing with the Nazis, of course. This idea that some people are inferior and not part of the Aryan race, which I've been doing a lot of reading about recently, the Aryan race. It's just the most incredible nonsense. And other people become subhuman or animals or regarded in a different way. Now, before we clicked the buttons and started recording, you told me about an episode during the Christopherson Tichborne case in
Portland.
Regale
all the Scientology execs were sitting in a room strategizing, and Mike Sutter he was formerly CO OSA Int and rose up to be WDC OSA Int, a very much thrusting his loyalty and affinity at Miscavige, a brown nose.
And that's what the WDC is, the Watchdog Committee, which is the senior most management body in Scientology at that time.
Right. And over OSA. Yeah,
the Office of Special Affairs.
So there would only be Miscavige, WDC, OSA, and then OSA. So back in the day, that was the structure. And Mike Sutter, out of the blue, blurted out, this was a $30 million judgment they had to pay, $30 million.
Yeah.
And he said, if anyone wants me to do away with her, that's Julie Christopherson Tichborne, if anyone wants me to make her vanish, here's my willingness. I'll come forward. This is actually posted on a site called Scientology Cult by someone, I think, who was there in the room. This is a known little anecdote. And you would imagine that somebody announcing they're willing to kill would have met with protest. And what? Mike Sutter, what did you say? Are you nuts? We're a religion, a church. We don't go around killing people.
We're the most ethical people on the planet.
Most ethical, perfect. And instead, there was a pin drop silence. There was no pushback. was no one even, what? I got to throw in one more very quick anecdote. People love little stories. There was a good guy called John, what's his last name? I'll pin it in the comments. And he was a rising star. He was CEO, commanding officer of Los Angeles CMO, messenger part. Then he went up to be CO, CMO int. And he did the unthinkable. He fled and joined David Mayo. He didn't only just blow, he joined David Mayo's group. Mm-hmm. And this little anecdote, I want to shrink it down and tell it real fast.
John Nelson?
Nelson! Oh, you got it. Oh, did you interview him?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
long ago, 1983. Yeah.
Oh, wow. I don't know if you know this story about John Nelson then, but I'm going to tell it to you because it came straight from, well, Janice Gillam Grady and her sister Terry Gillam were messengers overlooking a lot of internal traffic. And a homicide hit was ordered on John Nelson. And the way it was ordered was John Nelson was traveling to the Far East in that time period, Singapore or Hong Kong, whatever. It was on business. And the way they were going to do the hit was they were going to get one of their PIs, private investigators, to hire another PI who could hire a dirty PI. There's levels of cutaway. So is and the dirty PI was to leave 5 pounds of heroin or some such in his hotel room. When you have that quantity, you're a dealer. You're not taking that for personal consumption. And I think it was Singapore. And in that country, it's a death penalty to be a drug dealer of heroin. So the scheme was very crafted. They were going to make the government do the killing. Singapore would execute John Nelson, not the church could look completely innocent, but they engineered it. And this was moving forward. It's beyond belief. A former commanding officer of Commodore Messenger, a hierarchy of high up, got a death sentence, which the church was manipulating so that the Singapore government executed him for being a heroin peddler when the heroin was planted in his hotel room. You can't make this stuff up.
No.
But guess what happened? At the last moment, the dirty PI pulled out. He was willing to be dirty, but he didn't want to have the conscience of a killing on it. Like, there's dirty and dirty. You could take a little bribe, you can fudge, you can intimidate. But perhaps he was scared the ghost of John Nelson would haunt him from here till sun. You know, whatever the reason, at the last moment it got aborted. And John Nelson is alive to this day.
Which is a good.
Look at the cunning of this authoritarian cult. You see, I want to ask you, because you're so knowledgeable on this kind of cult, of what is their intention? It seems to me to dominate with complete overwhelm. I mean, what is the, when you just use the words authoritarian cult, what is their drive forward into the future? Would you sum it up in saying it's to dominate mercilessly? What is their major purpose? Over to you, John.
I think that Hubbard's drive, so many people over the years have said to me, he was in it for the money. And he did make a lot of money. He left $648 million when he died. And that's just what he hadn't managed to spend. So your money was significant, but I don't think that was his drive at all. I don't know if I've talked with you about this, but Charlie Nairn, the man who made The Shrinking World of L. Ron Hubbard, which is the most significant document about Scientology, as far as I'm concerned, because you see Ron Hubbard nervous as hell, completely unable to keep his TRs, his training routines in, the head of this group, who's meant to be the great expert on PR, falling apart on camera. You know, he doesn't look good with the blinking eyes and the slavering lower lip, and the filthy teeth, which are decaying in his head. He doesn't sound good. You know, he has no second wife, that the famous one. He has a first and a third. But Charlie told me that before this conversation, he talked with Hubbard for about an hour aboard the Apollo, with no one else around, early hours of the morning. And Hubbard pretty much admitted it's a scam. You know, it's just something I do to people. And it just happened to be that one of those moments. And so Charlie then sympathized with him, which was rather clever, really, and said, oh, it must be dreadful having to keep that hidden from everybody all the time, you know, poor you. And Hubbard, of course, being somewhat narcissistic, said, yes, poor me. It's so difficult. And he said, well, why do you do it? And what's the whole thing? And the first thing was, yes, it's lovely telling my wife every night we've made $10,000 today. We've made, not Scientology, we've put another $10,000, which would right now be, what would that be now? 1968. It's, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars every day. But the main thing is, I like to catch the clever ones and reel them in. And I get this image of a 10-year-old, somebody who's not really grown up, and that what they want is power and control over other people. Scientology is completely focused on one word, and that word is control. And he keeps coming back to it again and again and again. So, for example, in the upper indoctrination training routines, what a good choice of words that was, which were actually written by L. Ron Hubbard Jr. They took Jr. off the bulletins in the end because he was a bad boy and left. But in there, you've got this idea that will come out again in the objective processes, that you have to be able to show somebody that their reactive mind can be controlled by controlling them. And a whole, Hubbard keeps coming back to this. There's a piece called Start, Change, Stop, where he talks about this little booklet, where he talks about control. And there's good control and bad control. But Scientology is about control. It's about controlling people's behavior, their actions, controlling their bank accounts, that's for sure, and controlling their minds, controlling what they think. And I think that the back of Hubbard's mind, or wherever it was, his motivation was to do with tremendous personal insecurity. He lied all the time. You know, I remember interviewing Otto Rose, and Otto was really shocked after we'd talked for a few days, because he's saying, but Hubbard made these claims in his auditing. All of this stuff about the war wounds and all of these stories were there. And they're all made up. They're pretense. So he lived in this sort of fantasy world where he was the emperor. He was the source, the founder. And I think looking at the OT8 bulletin that was leaked, where he claims to be Lucifer, where he claims to be the Antichrist, and connecting that back to his time with Aleister Crowley's disciple Jack Parsons in 1946, that he, 45, 46, he had this desperate longing to be the boss, the one in charge. And I think, you know, when we look at the history of Hubbard and what happened in the 50s, what happened in the 60s, and then what happened with the Sea Org, everything was completely different. He now had power and control over people. He had them on his ship. They couldn't get away. He could now, if you were late by 1 minute, you could be thrown overboard. A terrifying experience, according to all the people I've talked to who had it happen to them. You could be shoved in the chain locker in the cleaning out the bilges in the ship. He basically reinvented the kind of 18th century Navy where you were completely dependent on him. When he locked Bruce Welsh up, he didn't need the permission of a court or a psychiatrist, because everybody was with him. And I think after that collapsed, because I have the sense that his own mind was going, looking at, certainly by the end, I'm sure he suffered from dementia. But I think that he just wasn't keeping it together. So the whole idea was control. Miscavige is a different sort of personality to Hubbard. Hubbard was mildly sadistic. He was somebody who liked to humiliate, punish, and abuse people. He particularly liked shouting at people, which I'm sure it probably saw a certain amount of that. The severe reality adjustment, where you burn somebody to the ground and make them feel like nothing. All of this Dianetics will release your trauma, and then Ron Hubbard will inflict trauma upon you, who will directly and personally do that. I must say that when I found that out, that was about the finishing stroke for me with Scientology, to go, well, why would I want to be like him? Just a few days ago, videos been put out accusing me of being passive aggressive and smiling too much, and that I must have a lot of anger. Well, really, I don't. I've never had anything much in the way of anger, and when I see it in other people, I have a very low regard for it. I would not wish to me, anybody that loses it, anybody that needs to bully somebody else into submission, they have something badly wrong with them. Now, Miscavige has that in spades. His desire and demand to control other people is pathological.
Yes.
Gone beyond what Ron Hubbard was doing. So, where your ex-husband, your former husband, Heber, spent, 8 years in a double trailer at the Gilman Hot Springs base? Who would want to do that to people? And what kind of pleasure are they getting? I mean, let's go out on a limb here. That I'm surprised that there's no sexual scandal surrounding David Miscavige. He appears to be asexual. He doesn't appear to have a sex life, from what I hear. And in such cases, long ago, Wilhelm Reich put forward the view that his master Freud was wrong, that, sex is the problem, but it's just people who can't get their rocks off who have a problem. And so he said the basis of fascism was the inability to have a decent orgasm. And maybe this applies to David Miscavige. I do hope he's watching.
I'm sure you're watched and summarized very closely. Back to Hubbard and dementia. Jeffrey did some dynamite recordings with Bill Franks, our dear friend Bill Franks.
Former executive director international of Scientology during the...
And Bill Franks was told something by Dr. Denk.
Eugene Denk.
Scientology doctor of record. And Dr. Denk didn't know that, well, first of all, Bill Franks was sent to Dr. Denk with an order to get the implants out of his brain. I mean, go figure. This hypothetical, theoretical implant. The order was to pluck it out of his brain. But Dr. Denk didn't know that Bill Franks had fallen and was no longer the permanent executive director that Hubbard had ordered. And so he spoke to him as if he was still a senior exec. And Dr. Denk, this is all on Bill Franks' heartfelt interview. Well, he did a few interviews with, in one of the interviews he told Jeffrey, Dr. Denk said, Hubbard has the onset of dementia.
Okay.
His mind, this, of course, Bill Franks had already toppled, but Dr. Denk didn't know.
So this would be about 1981, somewhere around there, when Bill had stopped being, because
it would have been very soon after, because the news slowly trickles out, but the world doesn't know of these big musical chair events. There's a time lag. And so Denk didn't know he was talking to an ex-Edian. He was talking to the Edian and felt bound to reveal a warning that Hubbard was already, on it. And, the word control resonates with me. In 1987, I said something I shouldn't have said. What did I say? I revealed that, I was also in staff, I revealed that Jesse Prince, Vicky Asnaran had been removed from their high posts. And I should not have said it. And I agree I should not have said it. But I could have been hauled into what they call cramming and just thwapped around and corrected. And don't, till these things come out an issue, don't say it. Instead, David Miscavige will rue the day he summoned me to INT for saying this. And for 6 months, first of all, I was a young mother taken away from my 2-year-old son who was in Los Angeles. And I was put to hard manual labor. It was torture. INT base was, if there is such a thing as an implant station, that was it. I would be hauled out of bed at 2 a.m. to get horrific questions that just spun me. It deliberately, did you go to a psychiatric institution that you didn't even know you went to this lifetime? I mean, I was a loyal class 12 CS. I was a statistical wonder, year after year, auditor of the year, another signed e-meters by Hubbard. I was on the job. And now I was being asked, well, when you had dental stuff, could they have given you some kind of sentence in the dental anesthesia? And you know why I got all this? I asked to leave. I didn't want to be at INT-base.
Yeah.
And I went to Chief of Security, Gary Moorhead, bless his heart, tells stories now and again of me. I went to Gary Moorhead and I said, I'm going to get in my car and I'm going to bust through the gates. And this was an earthquake. Nobody threatened INT-base that they would leave and blow by smashing their car. Well, it was a stupid thing to say. The next thing is that it took away my car keys and immobilized me. So that control, no car. But it was hell. Those 6 months was the beginning of the end for me. I knew now what a rogue, wicked, evil control group taking away. There was uproar in the United States when parents were separated from their kids. People trying to cross the border would cross the border with kids and they would separate. There was uproar. I saw that the culture does not agree with a mother being torn away from her kid. I was separated. And Heba was in Germany handling a huge, Germany was blowing up to high heaven. Heba went to handle that. So Alexander, my 2-year-old, had no mom. I was forced to hard labor at INT-base, and Heba was in Germany. I didn't even know who took him home at night if he had it. I didn't know what was even happening to him. Now, that was total control. Every inch of the day, I was to do. You know who I was under? Andre Tavayoin was my boss. Andre. I did see him slam people against walls, but he never touched me. But Gary Moorhead, the chief of security, was personally told this sentence by David Miscavige. Make sure de la Carriere's fingers are shaved down to the bone with the hard manual labor you give her. Oh boy, Gary got the intent of that. When Miscavige says, work her manicured fingers down to the bone, what does that mean?
It seems to suggest that he's a sadistic psychopath, but that could just be the way I interpret it, you know.
You know, he is a sadist and he enjoys it. One day he asked his assistant, Larice, when you summon up all the int-base execs and I come 2 hours late, what are they doing while they wait for me? And she said, sir, they are quaking in their boots. And Miscavige rooted with laughter. He found that hilarious, that the fear he could engender caused their insides to have panic attacks and anxiety. And you know, John, you're the historian. It seems like the most brutal, the most vicious, the most psychopathic inevitably bubbles to the top. Hence we have Hitler. Go ahead and name some of these.
Stalin, Mao.
Stalin.
And we have quite a crop at the moment. Of course, you've had
Idi Amin. Yeah, the most brutal. Who was that Italian?
Mussolini. And
Mussolini.
Then we have Franco in Spain, and
yeah, the most
in
brutal, the most fearful, somehow takes the power position. And so it is with Miscavige. Miscavige is completely, you know, his father recently passed. You know that, right?
I do.
Miscavige.
Dear man, yeah. Right.
Yes, he left a legacy. We did at least 30 videos back in the, 2-3 years. And
I talked with him just last year, just the one time. But
I'm so glad you got him. Yeah.
What a charming man. And afterwards, he showed me his convector trumpet as well.
Oh, yes.
It's great.
He, Ron told me, it's an anecdote that he told me so many times that I want to tell it to you. I know the audience will like it, but this one is for you. He seemed to forget that he'd already told me this. But I think he got such pleasure. I let him repeat it. I didn't remind him, Ron, you told me this a dozen times. He was with another musician, gold musician called Fernando Gamboa, who was the husband of Terry, the messenger. And they were really like blood brothers because they were gold musicians, went through all this sleep deprivation together and everything. And Fernando privately told him 4 words. He said to him, Ron, we've been conned. And Ron Miscavige had this huge, it was almost an epiphany. When you get a moment of truth, suddenly all the dots connected, because when he first came out, he was still justifying, well, they have some goodness, they have some techniques for communication, blah, blah. Ron, we've been conned. And somehow he had a moment of enlightenment when you get a correct indication of absolute truth. You can have almost an epiphany.
Of course you can, yeah.
Yeah. So he just luxuriated.
Wait, he told me that he looked at himself in the mirror, and it was, he saw himself and knew that all of these years this thing had been going on. I remember when his book came out, and I thought it was ever so funny because the guy who published it had published Tony Ortega's Unbreakable Miss Lovely, brilliant book. Before that, he'd put Barefaced Messiah by Russell Miller back into print. And now he was publishing a book which in the back had recommended reading. It had Ron Hubbard books as recommended reading, because Ron Miscavige still was hanging on to it. I was surprised in talking to him that he said that he thought that his son had been okay till 1993, I think it was, and going, sorry, no, he was never okay from when he was 17 and joined the CMO, talking, or I corresponded with Didi Vogading, who of course was commanding officer of the Watchdog Committee and head honcho of Scientology, with the executive director international somewhere down below her. And that she said that he was the action chief, and that the thing about him was, if you wanted something done, David Miscavige was the right person to ask, and because he would straight away do it. So she said, for instance, if I had a wall that I needed knocking down, I'd say, David, I need the wall knocking down. He'd lower his head and charge. Like, bang, it would be done. And I think this profound activity, he's a very physical person, and he somehow derives his satisfaction from the control of other people, as we said, and that's not at all untypical. That one of my favorite movies is The Death of Stalin. I don't know if you've seen that. It's a comedy by Armando Iannucci. It has Michael Palin in it as Molotov, the inventor of the famous cocktail, and it is not inaccurate that Stalin, when he died, was left for hours because the guards didn't dare go in the room, because you got put on a death list if he was annoyed with you. And there's this wonderful scene where Michael Palin, as Molotov, is told, I think by Beria, the head of the Czech of the KGB, that his wife is on the death list. And Molotov says, well, if she's on the list, she must have done something. And that's the level of control. I saw it in Scientology, where somebody's put on an SP declare list and they're now non-persons. And I'm kind of going, but you're meant to have a committee of evidence, court of ethics, a bill of particulars. You're meant to have findings and recommendations. This is what the system says. And when I challenged an ethics officer about that, he said, yeah, these suppressives can be so devious, or something like that. This idea that this is authoritarianism, when I'm given information and I'm meant to simply believe it, there is no choice of evidence. I mean, again, this attack on me recently, and I'm not going to send people to it. I mistakenly said that Hubbard had offered his brainwashing techniques to Kennedy in a letter. And I'd misremembered something. And this is now a piece of evidence to show that nothing I say is true. Well, you don't have to get into that. If somebody picks up a copy of Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, there are 1,117 reference notes. Now, I will occasionally, like other human beings, misremember things. I admit it. And I'm willing to admit it, which I think makes me different from some of my critics, certainly. There needs to be evidence. We need to be allowed to check it. And heck, that's what Hubbard said from the start. But the evidence, we weren't allowed to check it. And you should be able to go and look at this and what did he say and what actually was happening. And instead, we get the truth rundown. This thing that occurred long after I'd left. And I remember my jaw dropping at Toronto in 2015, where Chris Shelton, in one of his first public appearances, stood up and told us about the truth rundown. This thing, anything that you say that disagrees, anything in your experience that disagrees, will now get to the point where you realize that wasn't true.
Yeah.
So, everybody merges into, I think of it as like the Borg in Star Trek, this where everybody is all in one mind. And I put an apostrophe in it and call it the B-org. We've had the A-org and now we've got the B-org, where all Scientologists are going to uphold and follow command intention in a completely self-determined way. All of these conflicts, all of these essential and simple contradictions that we're faced with, which come down to the, David Miscavige becomes the dad of the dysfunctional family, and the family has to do whatever he says. And if he changes his mind about something, then that's now the truth. The truth will be a movable feast that is dictated by David Miscavige. It shocked me, his takeover, because I was there as it was happening. I'd left in '83 and watched, I believe that the issue that appointed Pat and Annie Broker as the first loyal officers was a genuine issue. I think that Ron Hubbard really did leave Scientology to Pat and Annie Broker. But from what I'm told, and I have no personal information, so I apologize to Pat Broker in advance if the information I've been given is inaccurate, but I'm told that he had something of a drink problem. And that what Hubbard particularly liked about him was that they could sit around drinking. We talked about dementia. Let's just throw in that in the very rapid autopsy that was performed on Ron Hubbard, they found puncture marks where he'd been injected, and a drug called Vistaril, which, an antipsychotic, was in his system. So whether that was because David Miscavige and friends had decided they needed to give it to him, or whether it was because Eugene Denk was going, what on earth could I do to make him seem compos mentis? I don't know. But I do think that Pat Broker was given it, and there was nobody left who had any ability to stand up. The one thing I found out about Miscavige very early on is that when he was a cameraman, when he first met Hubbard, when he was 17, working on the tech films, all of which have been scrapped, all of Ron Hubbard's incredible films have just been thrown away by David Miscavige, which is an atrocity. They should have won the Palme d'Or at Cannes, no doubt. I may be being a little bit sarcastic here. But when he was working on those films, it said that he would at times disagree with Hubbard. He would say no. And I've noticed this with other bullies, that their favorites are the people who oppose them. And I think that the upper echelons of Scientology had become so beaten down, so lacking in self-determinism, and so sycophantic, that when Miscavige pushed through as the new leader, they just, Guillaume Lesevre, Mark Yeager, the people who were there around him, who would then spend 8 years in the double trailer, the whole, they just caved in, to use Hubbard's term. They just allowed him to take them over. And that is what authoritarianism is, where people don't stand up and say, no, that's wrong. You shouldn't be talking about killing people, that's unethical. It's, but the means and the ends that people become willing to do anything because my first metaphor when I left Scientology, of course I wasn't going to read any psychology, because, well, that's the work of the devil, isn't it? Psychology, anything psychic. So it took me 7 or 8 months until I started reading books about the brain and things like that, really terrible. I had to come out of the conditioning, out of the implanting. So the first model that I looked at was an animal model. And it seemed to me that what Scientology does is it tames and breaks people. It makes them subservient. It doesn't make them creative. It doesn't make them capable of discovering technology themselves, or bringing forward their own godlike nature without the control of Ron Hubbard. And so you're becoming subservient.
Confiscates, absolutely kidnaps and annihilates your ability to think through everything. You must only refer to source, and you must only think through the filter and lens of what Hubbard says. And
not what Hubbard did, because if you go, what would Ron do? The usual answer is run away. That's what Ron usually did. If he talked about people blowing because they have transgressions, overts, crimes, sins, whatever. And so they can't stand to be in a place anymore. Well, firstly, psychopaths don't behave that way. They couldn't care less. So they don't have any guilt. The sort of people that do really bad things don't feel guilty, don't run away. But Hubbard did. Hubbard, when you follow his movements over the years, he's always running away. You know, when the Elizabeth, New Jersey Foundation fails, he runs to Cuba. He's brought back in Don Purcell's private plane to Wichita, Kansas. He lasts a few months there. Then he's in Phoenix, Arizona. Then he's, by the end of the year, giving the Philadelphia doctorate course. Then he's in London. Then he's in, and round he goes. He keeps running away. He keeps getting away from things. But he also, so I looked at this just as a zoological thing, you know, that people were taken over and made to be the agents of Hubbard, and then would sort of disappear into, you know, when challenged on any point, there'd be some immense justification. You know, I remember in a course room once, this guy had a PhD in physics and he worked for NASA, right? And he was the course supervisor at the Birmingham. I think it was still a mission then, maybe it had become an org by then. And so, yeah, he's pretty educated. He's a lot more educated than I am. Let's face it, I dropped out of school at the age of 17. And it's just got worse since then. What can I say? So he's got a PhD in physics. He works for NASA. And I'm doing the data series evaluators course. And there's this wonderful policy that says some 14th century psychiatrists. And so I look at it and I go, oh, I see what that is. The 4, when it's written down, can look like a 9. And a 9 can look like a 4. It should read some 19th century psychiatrist. So I summoned the course supervisor and said, you know, I think there's a misprint here. And I got into this elaborate argument about faculty psychology and Thomas Aquinas, rather than just saying, oh, it's a typo. Everything has to be justified. Everything has to be seen this way. And when you then start pulling down, you know, you take Obnosis and the tone scale and what it says and compare it to Scientology 8008, which is in complete contradiction to it, the social and chronic tone thing. I got sent to cramming over that. And eventually you just have to say, yeah, I've got it now. You know,
Yeah. I get what you say when I'm going to retread backwards here too. What is the purpose of an authoritarian cult? What is their drive? What is their main game? What game are they playing? I can't just think it's to control. It's not savage enough because it's either to control utterly or because there's a power push within the control. It's to subordinate, to subliminate, to make you into a dot. Because just control, if we just use only the word control, it doesn't have the oomph
Well, you need
of what an authoritarian cult does.
Yes, complete, absolute, utter control. And I liked your use of the word. I liked your use of the word confiscate. I thought that was a very elegant use of the word confiscate, because that is what happens. And it is that sense of, I mean, Hubbard did explain it in the Philadelphia doctorate course, which is a hell of a way to get a doctorate, 6 weeks of listening to a bloke talking. I mean, for just $500, no problem at all. But in that course, he explains most of what he's going to do. It's interesting that it was spread around so far because, of course, he has 3 mentions of Aleister Crowley in there, his very good friend, who, of course, he'd never actually met. And Crowley thought he was a con man and wrote as much. But he also gives this description, which I think, I mean, somebody pointed it out to me. I'd read it and not really got how significant it was. Somebody pointed it out to me at the bunker in the comments section years ago. He said, oh, there's this passage where Hubbard says, having accepted that life is a game, everything is a game, which I'm not totally with personally, but that's what he puts forward. In Scientology, you're Satan, you're just playing a game. So He then says, and in a game you have pieces. And the important thing with the pieces is they don't know the rules.
Mm.
Then you have the player, and the player's job is to keep the rules hidden from the pieces, because otherwise they'll become players.
Mm.
Then you have the game maker, and the game maker doesn't follow the rules. He makes the rules, but he doesn't have to follow them. And for me, that describes the control we're talking about. He also talked about broken pieces elsewhere. And I think that Scientology is about turning people. It's the opposite of what it says. It's through the looking glass, you know, it's the other side. That rather than you being given complete self-determinism, it's pretty obvious you're not. You know, it's pretty obvious that you do as you're told or else. And you pay for it and you like it. You smile about it. It's a fascist situation. It moves from being authoritarian.
You've already gotten in all your friends and your whole life. You know that the threat, what's going to happen if you start acting up and bucking the system.
Yeah,
you're going to lose all relation, including parents, children, siblings, twin sisters, anything that you hold very dear to your heart, you will lose.
Yep.
So you are kept in line. Many people toy with departing and leaving, and then they weigh the cost of leaving, and then they just stay. But here's a final question. We may be running into our 1 hour, I don't know. Is there a day of reckoning for cults like this? Is there a day of reckoning? Is it sustainable? Can it really go on ad infinitum? That's my question, John.
I think it has done. And one of the most basic beliefs in human culture, it's found in Sumeria, it's found in Babylon, it's found in India, it's found in Egypt. So fundamental idea, it's the foundation of Zoroastrian religion. And this is the idea that there is a battle between good and evil going on. Yeah. Ron Hubbard got very involved with this and believed in the sons of light and the sons of darkness, which is the Zoroastrian way of putting this. And I believe, I've been told by several people that there was security checking on the E-meter aboard the ship to find out which party you belong to, whether you were a son of light or a son of darkness. This is called Manichaeism. It's the idea of a dualistic universe where good and evil are in battle. We saw it most recently in QAnon. This idea that Donald Trump was the savior. He was going to drain the swamp. Everything was going to be fantastic. You know, he was going to change everything. And of course, we didn't see any of those changes. We're still left with the corrupt world that we had before he started. You know, personally, I'd like to see whoever's been involved with Guantanamo Bay dealt with by a court. And I'm not talking about the people, the 50 people are still being held there. I'm talking about the torturers and that sort of stuff. And Donald Trump did nothing about that. Joe Biden's going to do nothing about it. And Barack Obama did nothing about it. So, but looking at the world as good and evil, good versus evil, it, to me seems a childish way of looking at the world. And that is authoritarianism. We have actually been involved in a struggle, which is, I believe, towards humanism, towards having a regard for other human life, all of it. And, you know, seeking to create a sustainable society that cherishes humanity. Authoritarianism, it's almost that, you know, some people believe that we're basically good, which Hubbard kept saying but didn't believe. And some people think that we're basically evil. When Carl Rogers, the famous founder of humanistic psychotherapy, put forward the view to Martin Buber, the famous Jewish theologian, he said to him, I think you'd agree with me, Martin, that man is basically good. And Buber looked at him, he said, yes, man is basically good, and evil. And I do think, I'm very optimistic about the human future, much more so than anybody else I know. Almost everybody I know thinks that we are going down the tubes, and that we just better hide that and have a nice time and dance while we have chance. I don't see that at all. I see an awakening of ethical concern in the human race. It certainly wasn't there 100 years ago. 150 years ago, we've still got 4-year-old children climbing chimneys and going down mines. So I see this awakening. The Me Too movement, the exposure of child sexual abuse that has happened in the last 10 years, and shows how deeply our institutions have been involved in this despicable corruption. So I see these changes, but I see just one thing that I think is tremendously significant, and the thought's not new. Martin Luther King said, it's not the evil people we have to worry about. It's the mediocre people. It's the people who do nothing. It's the people who let it happen. And I think the change that has to come is for us all to realize we're all important. Every human life is important. And we're all contributing something, because, even on an evolutionary basis, it's believed by many that they still believe in modularism, that we had these modules that developed in our brains when we were on the savannah, at the beginning of Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago. And there's nothing we can do about it because we inherited these genes and they're making us do things. And they're selfish, apparently, these genes. That idea is actually gone in contemporary biology. It's still out in the world in, say, Yuval Harari's book, Sapiens, which is telling us we can't help it. It's predestination, it's Calvinism. The reality is that we can, moment to moment, write on our genes. We can change ourselves genetically. And there's nothing spiritual about that. It's called culture. It's called language. It's called understanding and changing. We are of all of the animals, the one that has the capacity for absolute change. And we're at that moment. And I see that authoritarianism is the problem, not the individual cults, but the way of thinking that, we should check things for ourselves. We even accept that John Atack could be wrong about some things. We need to check them. We should not be making gurus. We should become our own parents, and we should take responsibility in the society. And I see that potential. I see a lot of people moving towards goodness and wanting to help and change the world. So that's about it. Does that in any way answer your question?
It's kind of a nice uplift you've done there. So we're going to leave it there, but you didn't answer my question. And I want to take that up in our next video, which is, will Scientology get a day of reckoning? Not going into the future, not the PR freefall that they're already in. I'm talking about a day of reckoning. I want your prediction on that. But let's get into that in another show. This has been uplifting, and I think your perceptions are so right and so right on the nose. And that was very nice, John.
Good. I mean, and the answer to the question is yes, there'll be a day of reckoning, but we'll talk about how and why that might be.
Okay. That's a whole different thing. We hardly even touched our proposed. Anyway, next. It just goes the way. It just takes on its own pathway.
That's what happens when self-determined.
Spontaneous.
Yeah, it's what happens when self-determined people have conversations.
Yes.
Which is great. Yes.
Well, if you've come this far, you're listening to John, and you're listening to different viewpoints and little anecdotes, little stories. Can you please once again join us, subscribe, click the bell so you get notified. You will not get spammed. You'll only get notified when John releases a new video. And go to the donation button, send John a little money, become a patron, feel you're part of us, you're part of the clique of the ATAC forum.
Yeah, and we're going to change the world, whether the world likes it or not. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Love to you, John.
Yeah,
Bye-bye. Take care.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.